What's up, everyone? Welcome. We have a great episode for you today. We interviewed Mary Jane Oatman, the founder and owner of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. We got into some really interesting stuff with her. We talked about the opportunities that lie ahead for tribes across the country and across the world, as well as the challenges that they face in the Indigenous community and the cannabis industry and the cannabis community more broadly. But before we get into that, I have a couple things that I want to hit real quick. The audio on this was a little bit more kind of not as good as it typically is. I apologize for that. We had some technical issues. One of those things where I updated my recording streaming software right before the show and it caused a bunch of issues. So apologies for that. We'll try to get that straightened out in future episodes. But I tried to clean up the audio and make it better for you guys. So thank you so much for sticking it out. Thank you for your support. And without further ado, let's go to the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Q Grows. We are not live on Cannabis. We had some tech issues tonight, so we're just recording this one locally, and then we're going to upload this later to our community on Cannabis, as well as youtube.com/Cannabis. So shout out to all of our supporters on Cannabis. We super appreciate you. Your support every month helps us do things like these interviews and host the community and everything like that. So huge shout out to our supporters. And then also thanks to tikimadman.com for helping support the show. If you need great genetics, please go check out tikimadman.com. Today we have a really exciting guest. We're super excited to have Mary Jane Oatman from the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. She is a executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition and editor slash publisher of THC magazine. It's the Tribal Hemp and Cannabis magazine. She comes from I don't want to butcher the name of your your people and your tribe here. So actually, I want to ask you, what is the name of your people, Mary? How can I pronounce that?
Well, the given name to us, or the legal name, is the Nez Perce tribe,
Okay.
but we actually call ourselves the Nimiipuu people. So I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, I didn't want to completely botch that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Um, Mary is very dedicated to the preservation and restoration of indigenous communities and their economies, and we are very honored to have her on the show. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much for having me. It's quite an honor.
No problem.
My honor.
And it looks like JR is having some technical issues. Maybe it's just some weird things in the internet tonight. So he'll join in at some point, but I'll kick things off with our first question that we had for you tonight. So, Mary, as we get started, we'd love to have you kind of first start with how you first got into the cannabis industry or the cannabis scene, and what was it like for you and your community, kind of going through that whole process.
When I'm asked that question, my instant reaction is to talk about, what's happened since everything has become, legal in, certain patchwork patterns across the United States or even just globally. And then I realized that this cannabis scene has been a part of my life forever. My mom smoked cannabis with me and all of my brothers and sisters while she was pregnant and has, given birth to six healthy, happy, contributing members of society, all adults with our own children, very much, productive citizens. But I remember watching and not really understanding what was going on at the time. My parents really trying to make ends meet with, what's now being referred to as a legacy cannabis market. So it's been a part of my life forever.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing there. So, and JR, welcome back. So
Yeah,
the our
sorry about that.
no worries. Must just be gremlins in the internet tonight. Um, you actually just kind of touched on our next question that we had for you, which was about the if you had history of cannabis use in your family. I don't know if you want to kind of expand on that a little bit more.
Well, yeah, I definitely have had a history of cannabis use in my family. I mean, the written record of it goes clear back to the signing of the Treaty of 1855 with the Nez Perce. A lot of the Treaty Council minutes of that sacred signing of our people's retaining of rights. The journal of the United States government agents that were there negotiating and brokering that deal talk about the incessant pipe smoking of the men as they're treaty counseling, and that was a big part of those negotiations as well, was for our people to just be able to live our culture, live our way of life, our traditions and practices. And a lot of these pipes that have been found on our homelands in these archaeological sites, they go back tens of thousands of years. So there's definitely the ethnobotanical record of it within our people's record, but within my own family, I had to try to find a way to take um, my grandma's story and turn it into something positive in this thriving industry. I'm here in Idaho. There is no legal form.
Yeah.
It is still very, very much criminalized. Dogface, the
Yeah.
celebrity recently, in trouble here in Idaho over paraphernalia possession.
Right.
And I think maybe some residue, nothing of, quantity amounts, but that's just really the backwards mindset that we have to deal with. And so while, it's emerging as $1 billion industry, I see the disparities and disadvantages for people like my grandmother, who is on the cover of the very first issue of THC magazine, and she was my inspiration. I tried to figure out how I could take that family history and create this place of storytelling about what's happening for tribes, not just in cannabis, but there's a lot in fuel development and fiber opportunities on the industrial side. Negative stigma, a lot of work to do to eliminate that. So that's really where I saw taking my own family's use and lack of opportunity and disparities that are in the industry, and propel them through story.
So, what kind of varieties do you kind of remember first seeing, or what kind of flavors were there when you were first coming into the cannabis scene?
Oh gosh, when I was a little, well, I just went cannabis scene when I was a younger girl, teenage. That was when it was so back and forth with access. I remember my sister and I, just kind of like sneaking around into our parents' stash tray. And there was just hard times in the Idaho economy and access during that time. And it was just like, pressed Mexican brickweed with a lot of seeds and a lot of stems. And that was like during a hard season. And then at the, flip side of that, my dad was a grower and he had quite the green thumb. And so in, fall harvest time, I'd have access to some really amazing, but it was hit and miss. He was scared to grow. He didn't grow every season, but um, I had some access to some good quality products, but that was one thing that I was never really attuned to, was, strains and cultivars like I am now, knowing what works best for me, what different strains help me throughout the day or into the evening. But that kind of stuff just didn't even dawn on me when I was younger, and I saw my parents like, selling, a lot of volume of cannabis when I was a young girl.
Nice, good. I mean, we've all kind of started somewhere, huh, in this journey. So, go ahead, Q. I
Oh
think
yeah,
you
that's
have the
right.
next one.
I got the next one here. Thanks. Let's see. So, can you talk a bit more about the relationship between cannabis and the indigenous communities, and explain the significance of cultural and traditional practices with cannabis in the indigenous community, or in the indigenous cannabis community?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I descend from the Nez Perce people. We're a a people that's always had a reverence for the sacrament of the smoke. You know, the term since time immemorial is used a lot to describe our connection to the landscape and to all of the gifts that Mother Earth provides. And, you know, we always had this opportunity to develop these reciprocal relationships with things like teaching plants. And I think that it would be, even as an introduced species onto our homelands, a way to develop a relationship with it. And so I can speak to my own people's relationship and the story that I've, you know, been told as far as our seed acquisition. But one thing that I found really beautiful about doing this work with THC Magazine and then coming out with like tons and tons and tons of story like this, our magazines are filled with just like a plethora of stories of tribal communities, and the reclamation of each cultural geographical area and their connection with seed, with rope, with smoking sacrament. They're all on their individual journeys to reclaim those stories. And that's, you know, happening in kinship systems through families, not necessarily through government systems, but I would like to see them support what happens, you know, because that's one thing that's, you know, happened is we now have all of these tribal governments that kind of oversee now and protect the rights of the people. And some of them don't always embrace a pro-cannabis approach and work to decriminalize it. And, you know, oftentimes those are communities that are very much connected to a pre-colonial, I guess, commerce with cannabis.
So would you say, I mean, it's fair to say that a lot of the different tribes in the nations, like you say, kind of have their own attitudes and are kind of moving at their own pace?
Very much so. There's, you know, in the state of Washington, 21 of the 27 tribes have entered into compacts with the governor to operate recreational retail dispensaries. And, you know, there's tribes, I mean, that's more dispensaries than being operated by California tribes collectively, and there's well over 100 tribes in California. So a lot of it has to do with the level of relationships that they have, or the standing that they really feel within their own, you know. And honestly, California tribes have had it really rough. I mean, they were suffering raids from the federal government early on, and that makes them gun shy. And I think that's probably the biggest obstacle that we have right now, is that, you know, some of our tribes just really have stronger footing, more effective government to government relations within their states to be able to just grow and build out in this new industry. And most tribes, a majority of them, are still in the shadows of this uncertainty because it is federally illegal.
Right.
So, kind of speaking of that, what are the kind of current attitudes of the local law enforcement towards cannabis in your area, and is it any different than in the past?
Oh, goodness, if anything, they are heightening their efforts to let it be known that there's a zero tolerance policy from local county officials as well as state law enforcement in Idaho, very much so. On the tribal side of things, it's usually just, you know, a slap on the wrist. The tribe is not arresting people over cannabis like the state and county officers still have a tendency to do. It's not uncommon for them to, because we have a unique situation near our reservation where within a 30-mile drive, we have access to about 8 recreational retail dispensaries. So we have, you know, the opportunity to cross the border over into Washington state, make purchases illegally, and then bring them back to the reservation. And the gray area is kind of the in between, getting from Washington to the reservation. There's this
Right.
big chunk of Idaho, we're going to get you law enforcement mentality. And yeah, they train their officers very well to detect the odor of marijuana, I tell you.
Yeah, it's funny how they have such a strong ability to smell cannabis.
um, let's see. So, that's next question was about kind of taking us back into how you became involved on the cannabis industry side of things. Could you tell us a bit about that story of how you kind of made that jump into the industry?
Oh gosh, it was a culmination of a lot of different things. I'm partially educated Indigenous woman, got my undergrad degree in justice studies, my minor in Nez language, and then from there I went off to get a master's in anthropology and started working in public policy around language development. Which, I mean, it's crazy how the world works, but working on policy and language initiatives, as well as state education policy over the course of my career, landed me an amazing opportunity for an appointment under the Obama administration to serve on the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. And really, while I was also doing that work, I was serving as the president of the National Indian Education Association. And so I got to
Wow.
see, with that Venn diagram, that perfect nexus of how nonprofits really make policy work move forward, how it can really bring grassroots communities to the table. And then I go home, with this newfound perspective. And it's 2014, and tribes are left out of the Farm Bill, and they're getting raided over hemp. And so I switched gears. That's honestly what I did is I shifted gears from education policy to hemp and cannabis policy. Just spent the first few years learning who's doing what, advocating on the 2018 provisions, and doing it more just fly by the seat. And it wasn't until 2019 that I worked on forming like a formal nonprofit, moving towards the magazine production, and then more recently with the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. So now there's the 501c3, 501c6, so we can, work on a couple of different tracks to really empower tribal communities and do some fabulous work in tribal communities to not only engage, politically, but also on the grassroots side of things, crosswalking our individuals on like, what does it look like? How do you put up some, guardrails to become a legitimate business as a cannabis business?
Yeah, that's so interesting that it sounded like that one of your key takeaways from that experience working with the Obama administration and the various organizations that a nonprofit and or nonprofits I should say were kind of key to influencing the directions of things, I think you said. And so that's a really interesting point. Do you um could you talk a bit about that, kind of in relation to cannabis, and how do you see much of the in I guess I feel like maybe there's not that many nonprofits in the cannabis space. Maybe there are, and you probably yeah, I'm sure you know a lot more about that than I do. And I'd love to hear maybe what you think about kind of the opportunity there, because one of the things that we've talked a lot about on our shows, JR and I, is figuring out like how do we influence the systems like government to better embrace cannabis so that we don't aren't restricted to growing a few plants. If you're even allowed to grow, like in a state like Washington, you're not even allowed to grow. So I'd love to hear you. I know we're kind of jumping out of order of our questions, but I just thought that was such an interesting point that you made about nonprofits influencing policy.
Well, the reefer madness is running very deep in legislatures across the United States. We've noticed that, while demographics everywhere else shift, even in our Congress, it's still those, old silver-haired white guys, thinking they know what's best for everybody. And they don't know anything about cannabis as medicine. They don't take the time necessarily to become educated on their own about what's happening for research initiatives, or to really look at analyzing what's happening in states that have legalized a decade trend, to see that the alcohol use rates are down, and kids are not getting access to cannabis like they thought that they were going to, and that youth rates are down in states that have legalized. And really that education and advocacy for the cannabis plant as medicine really needs to come from the communities that are doing that work, or from the organized groups to uplift and carry those messages. That's how it just happens. That's how the political cogs and machines work. And so we just really need to make sure that those organizations exist, to make sure that all voices are represented. And that was one thing that I noticed, is with this, racial justice and social equity movement in cannabis, was that the I and BIPOC was really, really silent.
Yeah.
And we're such a marginalized group already, and then there's just this tendency with whether it be erasure culture, or just because of a lack of having inroads to communities, Indigenous communities, to build those relationships with, that it just doesn't happen. And so we, meaning the collective group of the workers that are out there doing it, of just trying to find some way that we could work in unity, to, it's more than anything, just shine the light on the dark little corner. The Indigenous cannabis communities are still here. We're still touching plants with our feet in the soil. And I think one thing that is really important about non-governmental organizations and nonprofits in this space as well, is that's when sustainable development initiatives and environmental goals, things and practices and best practices that are outside of economic incentives are brought into the bigger picture, where we can start talking about building an industry that's not just for the needs of us now, but that's planning for future generations. Corporate America is not going to do that, and that's what our nonprofit organizations globally are working to do, is to ensure that that at the end of the day, that the plant has the opportunity to retain her sacred essence as a plant. Common sense, she's a plant, not no boogeyman monster that the global cannabis czars have made her be.
Well, I know for a lot of us in the States, I'm in Oregon, and legalization has really kind of sucked a lot of the revenue that was going to the local communities, like we had back when we were a medical community. Can you tell us some of the ways the Indigenous cannabis industry plan on contributing to the economic development of its community?
Sure. One of the things that we're really excited to be able to do at the base level is just crosswalking our members, especially our members that don't have the resources, uh, to resources that we have through our convening scholarships for our policy summits and gatherings, so that they can network with business professionals. But at a bigger level, we're looking at mentorship programs, not just one time hit wonders, but like opportunities for them to meaningfully engage with business professionals, because they're out there, they're all over the place. Our tribal cannabis experts are across the board. Of course, that takes resources as a brand new organization. That's kind of why we're working on the model that we are now, of hosting these convenings and policy gatherings for lower fee registrations, to be able to get the money in the door, to be able to do some more of the external resources. Another part of that is on our tribal cannabis side of things, resourcing and kind of, I don't want to say vetting as a clearinghouse, but uh, honestly, those that are looking to authentically grow Indian country and not in a predatory manner, if you know what I mean, uh,
Yeah.
they're not finding a tendency to necessarily approach our organization because we've been around the block to know who's been out there talking tribes into the bad deals and really setting them up for failure. And it's been unfortunate to see tribes like the Warm Springs tribes there in Oregon have so much opportunity and have, the snake snake skin oil salesmen, cannabis consultants just, keep, trying to sell them something that's just not a good fit for their community. Um, we kind of have a blacklist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And for good or for bad, the the folks that are out there not doing good for the industry are finding their way out.
We were actually just
Yeah.
going to ask you about that, about kind of what kind
Yeah.
of challenges you've faced, or you feel like your communities face as you've navigated the industry. It sounds like um, figuring out who's there to help you and who's there to kind of take and not really contribute and help you out.
It's just such an emerging industry, and because it is still, federally illegal, there's not a one size fits all approach. It's a state by state situation. And again, if a tribe and tribes are in a state where they don't have good relationships with their state officials, then they're going to be a lot slower to the game. Unfortunately, what that also means is they're not necessarily talking to each other. I think that's one of the other challenges is, for tribes to work intrastate in developing compliance systems so that they can have, shared regulatory systems, not any system of the fox guarding the hen house, because um, there's something to be said about having robust regulatory systems. Tribes know regulations and compliance. I mean, we've built the gaming industry from nothing in Indian country as far as Indian gaming is concerned. So I have all faith and confidence that if tribes were able to just take down the fear of the conversation around cannabis, and that's also why the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association has been really working to, as an organization that's comfortable talking about these things, just kind of find our way into those spaces, putting in proposals to talk to leadership at the National Congress of American Indians at their conferences, going into these other spaces where it's not always or has ever there been a cannabis conversation, and just kind of lighten it up. That's what we do.
Nice. Good. And so would you say that your community does a good job of supporting and empowering Indigenous women and gender diverse people as in the cannabis community as well?
Oh, most definitely. I think that's been one of the things, I've had my own experiences. I've had some of my employees, not my employees, but some of my colleagues, if you will, endure the earlier Me Too bull in the cannabis industry in Washington state. I mean, so much so, that it's, created case law in the state. And there's just really, I think, a tendency for myself to just really gravitate towards finding the women in the cannabis industry. So through this journey, I've really developed some great relationships. I mean, like earlier this morning, I was on a conference call for planning of the NOCO Indigenous Pavilion with Winona LaDuke, who's become a really good friend. We try to find as many opportunities as we can to collaborate together. Another amazing cultivator in your backyard there is Jill Wheaton, owner of Hemp Best, one of the CBD cultivators licensed in the state. Mwah, does some phenomenal flower. And, and being able to get all of us together in one space, and we've done it before, had those kind of gatherings where we have Shinnecock Indigenous women, business leaders and cultivators meeting, coast to coast with women from California and Oregon. Um, I've been honored to be able to participate. Washington Cannabis Alliance actually hosted an event in September, and it was all Indigenous women leading the stage. And it wasn't necessarily that it was intentional, but I think that even in some of the areas where the men are in the leadership, they're kind of deferring to the women a lot of times to step up and lead the conversation.
And that kind of leads me into the next question. Is the Indigenous cannabis community doing good alliance work with mainstream kind of cannabis companies out there?
Oh, most definitely. We collaborate with the National Cannabis Industry Association, as one of the largest and oldest trade organizations in cannabis. Because, while we don't have money to put down at the table, being able to carry the water forward on the Indigenous perspectives for policy reform is important to them as an organization. So we are an affiliate member of the NCAI or NCIA. As far as other mainstream organizations, Cannabis Regulators Association, as well as Cannabis Regulators of Color Association, noticing, just trying to build solidarity with them, that they exclusively were only advocating for and excluding tribal cannabis regulators from their scope of advocacy work. And that wasn't necessarily intentional, but what we're also working on doing is, we have a lot of tribes under their tribal law and order codes that are running very robust cannabis operations, very regulated, and yet still being referred to as illicit markets because they're not state authorized. And so we're working on parity for Indigenous cannabis regulations mainstream with our partners. Minorities for Medical Marijuana, Students for Sensible Drug Policy is another one of those great alliances, working with Jason Ortiz, their executive director, to build a new and next generation of advocates because, old people are really good about talking about what's good for young people, but I know that we have
Right.
a cadre of thousands, tens of thousands of college students who are also very passionate about this, plus taking the next generation of plant medicines with psychedelics and psilocybin, and bringing that torch along, because common sense reform for both medicines. We can have that conversation at the same time. That's also not happening in Indigenous communities. So through allyships, we're able to get a lot more work done than we would just as a small community of loud, tribal cannabis advocates.
That's good. I think those partnerships and strengthening our community in every way, because our community as a whole has a struggle, and the feds haven't even laid down their hands yet. So the more we can align and the more we can push back against predatory lending, against overtaxation, those kind of things are going to be to our strength in the end if we can kind of pull together, because our community as a whole is very fragmented.
Yeah.
And I would like to see more unification in the cannabis community. And that's kind of one of the things that we're pushing for here on Cannabis, is to try to bring on these communities and let their voices be heard and try to provide a place for unity in the community. You know what I mean?
Yep. I do. I get you.
Well, the next question that we had for you, we were kind of, well, actually, next few questions we had, we're kind of touching more on the indigenous cannabis industry and kind of a little bit how it works, I guess you could say. So the first question that we had was, could you talk about what sort of measures that are in place or the things that you have to do to ensure the quality and safety of the cannabis products that you're serving or providing to patients in the indigenous cannabis industry?
Well, I actually had a really good conversation about this today, which is why we're looking at hosting a convening of cannabis regulators nationally tribal cannabis regulators specifically, and as well as getting them into the folds with the national cannabis regulators, because there are systems in place, and if we can you know, get some of the barriers down through education, as well as just increasing access to get more of these tribes on these systems, because what's happening in New York is definitely not an ideal situation. We have tribes that are very open to figuring out what cannabis regulations look like, and they're trying to take their steps slowly, but their tribal community members who come from that, legacy notion are just they're ready, they're turnkey, and they're just ready to make it happen. And so they've had shops just pop up by the dozens on reservations in New York, and they are not tested products.
Yeah.
They're not, there's definitely no product information on the packaging, and people are getting sick. And that's something that the tribal nations in New York definitely want to get a handle on, so that they're permitting all of their cultivators, they're testing their products that way. When they go to the table with, New York OCM, and they're talking about safety and regulations and really having a grasp on the regulatory system of control within the reservation, that then they can start talking about parity and reciprocity and maybe intergovernmental agreements with the New York markets. But right now, something like that wouldn't be possible, because they still have to work on shutting down the illicit indigenous markets that are existing within the tribal communities. And even that in and of itself is complex, because a lot of these families that are doing it, they also themselves feel like they have a right to, and they don't need any tribal government to tell them any differently. I mean, that's really what a lot of our indigenous people see the essence of sovereignty is that they don't need any governments telling them what to do.
Right. Do you see, kind of as this plays out in the future, do you see tribes kind of verticalizing their whole kind of industry, so you could have like a tribe, the local like lab that does the testing, and kind of, I just was kind of curious, like, do you see a lot of, I'm curious both on like the economic front and just how you kind of see the systems kind of being built. Do you feel like a lot of this stuff is going to be kind of self-contained, or do you see those tribes like in New York, they could just go get their cannabis tested at a lab, some lab that someone else is using? Just kind of curious how you see that building.
I think that there's going to be what we see kind of in the mainstream now within the legitimate markets, that there's always going to be this off channel of a black market,
Yeah.
while many try to figure out how to find a front facing legitimate business side of their industry. I think it also just really depends on how the language plays out. Um, I always look up north, to Canada, and what happened with First Nations communities up there when they were left out of the Cannabis Act in Canada. They figured out a red market, and then they just started to do it. And now the government in Canada is backtracking to create, and different provinces are doing it differently. But like in British Columbia, they have like an Indigenous equity program where it's like they're funding and coming up with business resources, business solutions, grants, all kinds of programs to help individuals get onto the legitimate cannabis Canadian marketplace.
Yeah.
And so I would say that, here we're kind of seeing that same thing. Michigan, Bay Mills tribe, they were not in the language for compacting like all of the Washington tribes were. And so they said, okay, well, there's case law, for parity with states. So like when a state legalizes gaming, for instance, and they can't restrict a tribe from participating in that economic activity. So they're using like some of the tenets of Indian law to say, well, if a state legalizes cannabis medically, then the tribe can then open up their own medicinal cannabis that's, equal to or more robust than what the state is operating. And
Yeah.
so that's mostly how the tribes are operating in any state where they've been left out of any language legislatively. I mean, even in states where they're not, they're still gonna, even if they're in their compacting language, some of them are like, we don't need a compact to do this.
Yeah. Inter-
Is that to say that they don't really need permission to do that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. They're saying we do not need any state tribal agreement to enter into this because, if you analyze those agreements and you look at, as long as the tribe's saying, we're doing all of these checklists as far as all of the safety protocols testing, and the only thing that has this, big question mark next to it is taxes, and
yeah.
they don't want to see any taxes. Most of the agreements that we're seeing, regardless of if they're under compacting or not, is that the revenue generated from retail cannabis operations on reservations are going back into community programs. I mean, they're not programs where they're set up to, be for equity investors. They're community based tax solution programs.
Cool. So do you see I'd love to kind of expand a little bit on this topic because it's really interesting. So are there if I was setting up a cannabis business or I wanted to start a dispensary or what have you, are you getting a license like from the tribe, or are you not even kind of handling that? I'm kind of curious because in the markets that have been set up so far, they've been just set up so that only like rich people, rich white people basically can partake in them because the licensing fees and all the hoops and everything are just insurmountable, especially in a like, the biggest offender I think is like Florida, where it's like you have to have like $50 million or something insane, to get a license. Um, kind of curious about I guess I'm asking about the barrier to entry and like how has your community thought about kind of lowering that or kind of helping people get into the industry?
There's some of our tribal communities and our tribal enterprises or governments that don't want to be in the plant touching industry, so they've opened up their law and order codes as well as their lands to leasing to outside companies, and they're generating revenue exclusively on compliance, permitting, and taxation. So a good example of this is the Sault Ste. Marie tribe in Michigan. They leased and licensed their property to Loom Cannabis, which is a multi-state operator. Those same types of tribal communities open up those ordinances to their tribal community members as well. So, I mean, there was tribes across California that were doing the same thing. Some of them, didn't necessarily have the greatest outcome in opening up and leasing their lands to even big cannabis. Some of the biggest names in the cannabis industry were leasing lands from tribes and dealing with a lot of complexities because of how they then get if it just created a lot of
Yeah.
complexities in communities where they maybe didn't do all of their due diligence. But the models that I'm seeing right now are working really, really well, where the tribes have even very, very low licensing fees to be able to come in and open up. But sometimes it's in how they're structuring their tax, where it's based on revenue generated. So if the cannabis dispensary does good, the tribe does
Yeah.
good. If it's a good up down downtime, that it's kind of a rolling scale based on that revenue.
That's
Do
cool.
you do you see that cannabis industry for you? Do you see you guys yourselves being able to position yourself in a way where you would have a competitive advantage over, say, the mainstream cannabis industry?
I definitely do. I see tribes already at a competitive advantage for the future of international trade that could possibly already be in the pipeline now with industrial hemp trade, as far as duty-free foreign trade zones. Definitely interstate transportation with case setting precedents with Washington tribes, even about interstate transportation, where they've held that the state cannot tax the tribe even on imported goods.
Interesting. This is really interesting. That's cool. I really, it's just
The
so
gray
interesting.
area just
Yeah.
gets more gray with indigenous cannabis, and especially when you look at, certain tribes that are ready to flex, their treaty rights. And again, like I said, it's not a one size fits all approach, and this is areas that has not necessarily been litigated. So, I mean, the future is bright.
Totally.
Good.
Could you talk a bit about how your industry, the cannabis industry, the indigenous cannabis industry, I should say, is working to promote sustainability and environmentally friendly growing practices, for example, or even sustainability kind of across the cannabis supply chain?
Oh, most definitely. We have done a great job of, aligning with a lot of the cultivators that are out there, have been out there for generations, working on regenerative practices that are, um, if they're not working in, sun-grown development areas, that are finding other zero and net waste solutions in cultivation practices. They're out there. It's possible. Sometimes it costs a little bit more on the front end to invest in, but that's what we've been really honored to be able to do as an organization, is find who those communities are, because they really are not, a lot of them are not taking the time to get behind a podium and really talk about the work that they're doing. They're just doing the work. An
Yeah.
example of that is, one of my girlfriends down in at Native Humboldt Farms, Lindsay Renner. Um, I think I came across her a couple of years ago on Instagram, and I was like, I have to know who this person is. And so I just reached out to her through Instagram. I was charged with building a panel for the National Cannabis Industry Association Sacramento mid-year business conference. And so I'm like, I'm hitting up Lindsay. I have this other friend out of Northern California, Lisa Sundberg, and she is the founder of the Indigenous Habitat Institute, and she's working solely on like tiny fiber homes, bio-based home solutions, hemp and non-hemp bio-based solutions, but primarily hemp and tiny hemp homes. And so I was like, oh my gosh! And then I want to find ways that all of these communities can gather together. And so when we're building our national panels as well as our state and local panels, we're always making sure to find ways that we can talk about building this new cannabis industry, keeping in mind the UN's 17 sustainable goals for sustainable development.
Yeah.
And also just being mindful of aligning ourselves with companies that have been out there, preaching the gospel about doing better, like Cannabis Doing Good in Colorado. Kelly Perez, and her partner Courtney have been, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to align ourselves with partners that already have, accountability checklists with, progress reports and continuous improvement plans. Because, some cannabis companies that are starting out, they may have been misconsulted and they really want to do better.
Right.
Nice. Yeah, really, huh? Is the Indigenous cannabis community working to build relationships with Indigenous groups that are outside of the United States, out there in the world?
Oh, heck yeah. I think probably one of the first 10 hits that we got on our website after we started as an organization was from, Indigenous communities in Colombia. And that had me completely lit up, because I'd already had this conversation with one of my Indigenous brothers in Canada who I'd already had, a lot of conversations with. One of the biggest campaigns that I did with THC Magazine was in partnership and collaboration with Honeysuckle Magazine. And we did this like 5 generations billboard with the message, breaking down the borders in Indigenous cannabis. And we actually had our billboard in New York City's Times Square, like corporate takeover. First cannabis billboard that I've ever done like this ever. And it was paid for by Legacy 420, which is a Canadian First Nations cannabis company. So, the difficulty when I was, having difficulty finding even very well off tribal cannabis communities in the lower 48, they didn't want to throw down that kind of messaging. But for me, I saw it as a high impact opportunity, and it really did. It created some big waves after that campaign. And from there, I just realized that I have to think outside of the box of what I think of as Indigenous as well. There's some great work planning in the works right now. I'm on a part of an ASTM D37 planning committee for an international Indigenous convening in Cape Town, South Africa in 2025. So
That's incredible.
in the last week in January, we're taking this international Indigenous conversation to this place where I now have a lot more to learn about what Indigenous means for South African communities.
Yeah. That's amazing work. I'm really excited about that. That stokes me a lot. I think a lot of people around the world can benefit from this industry, and I think that it can bring health and prosperity to a lot of people. So I'm really excited to see the global community kind of reaching out and coming on board. I think that's a powerful thing, and I think as more of our American influence on drug policies, as that starts to wane, I hope other countries and other indigenous communities can take that as a kind of a door opening to start taking control and command of their own destinies when it comes to the cannabis plant.
So Mary, we're kind of coming up on the end of our time with you, so we're gonna kind of try to roll up our next set of questions. I could say that kind of the theme for the last couple questions that we had for you is really about something that you just touched on just a couple minutes ago, which is about how we can maximize impact from a political perspective in terms of driving change, making sure that policies better reflect how you want things to work out there in the world. And so could you talk a bit about the various organizations that you're a part of and some of the political action that you have been engaging in currently or maybe most recently, and maybe kind of like the impact of that? Just love for people to kind of really learn from you and what you're doing.
Oh, definitely. One of the first organizations that I cut my teeth on was serving on the board of directors for the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And being newer in the mainstream cannabis industry, it was hard not to be, at first just starstruck to be sitting at a board table with the Al Harrington, and then to have Jesse Horton on the other side of the table. And then I just realized these are just people that are just trying to blaze trails like everybody else. They've just, more than anything, what I noticed was that was different and unique from the Indigenous cannabis communities while serving on MCBA was that the Black cannabis community was just like really organized. And then I was also serving on the board of directors while doing some work with Women Grow and participating in some of their leadership speaker opportunities in Washington, D.C. Got to get networked again with a bunch of very prominent Black women in cannabis. And I just, from the 30,000 square foot view, I just realized they're organized, and
Yeah.
so that's when I just realized more than anything, I just need to get this organization, rally the Indigenous community voice, and then, lock arms with these organized communities to do this work. So, MCBA, a lot of props to that organization, because to this day they continue to be an ally and a partner in this work. While I was serving on the board of directors there, I had the opportunity to serve with Dr. Rachel Knox. She has invited me, and so for the past 2 years, I've been serving on the Association for Cannabis Health Equity and Medicine, which is an international board of directors. Some very high profile, all puns intended, cannabis professionals. But what I thought was really unique was that they also want patient perspectives as well as Indigenous perspectives, and so I wear many hats just in that one role on the board of directors there. And then, of course, just our affiliate partners with like the National Cannabis Industry Association. The other one that really, I think, has done a lot of hard work, on the ground, and is, probably one of the organizations that I'm excited to partner with this year is Minorities for Medical Marijuana. Doing a lot of great work out there. But these state associations and state chapters and state affiliates, like I mentioned earlier, Cannabis Alliance in Washington State, we had, through our work in developing and forming, the Michigan Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Association was formed by a grassroots group of plant medicine ambassadors in Michigan. So really that's also what I see happening, is that we're going to have to, level up what we're doing as a national organization to meet the needs of our state affiliates for the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. Because if we're having, Michigan THCs popping up, hopefully we're going to see that happening other places. And then, places where they've tried to get organized, like the California Cannabis, California, California, I can't remember the CNOC, California Native American Cannabis Association, for them to, get some rejuvenized to do this work. Because really, if we're going to have this opportunity for tribes to have any kind of nation-to-nation trade that's outside of anything that the government may fail us, then we have to start talking as organized groups.
Nice. So now, if we want to get involved to help out the Indigenous cannabis community, how can we get involved and how can we show support? And before I say that, I just want to say a shout out to Farmer Freeman, who's in Washington, D.C. I try to get you two connected. I'm not sure if you guys were able to, but kind of give us an idea of how we can help help this movement and help this voice be heard.
Well, first off, the ICIA loves Jackson and loves Farmer Freeman.
Yay!
One of our sponsors for the DC Policy Summit. And, that's what our sponsors have allowed us to do, is to be able to hold historic convenings like our Washington, DC Policy Summit on our website at www.indigenouscannabis.org. You can watch our videos and see the impact that we've had in community. On that same website, you can find the ways to financially support the organization, become a dues paying member. As a trade organization, we really, our livelihood is on our organizational members. We have some big goals in 2023, aside from, starting up a mentorship program. We're working on a documentary, and, those things take resources, and we're really excited to document this historic movement that's happening in Indigenous plant reclamation. And so we look to get our roadshow out there. We've also taken on an amazing celebrity brand ambassador Most people know him as Uncle Brownie on the hit Reservation Dogs show on Hulu. Out there digging holes trying to find his old bud. But Gary Farmer is very much a plant medicine ambassador, very knowledgeable about what it's going to take to make a just transition, away from fossil fuels and emerge into a new responsible, carbon smart community of a future. And so Gary's hit the ground running as an ambassador, to do this work. And so we bring him with us every opportunity that we can get. So we're always out there trying to rally up a sponsor so that we can bring Gary on the road with us, because his celebrity status brings people in the door, for the selfie and for the social media stuff, but they're captivated and engaged to hear the wisdom that he shares from his own personal use with cannabis, how it's helped him heal, how he's used it throughout his life, and more importantly, his future vision for tribes leading in industrial hemp production.
Cool. That is cool.
Well, Mary, so we just have another last couple questions before we let you go. The next couple, I think we could kind of maybe roll into one, which is before we let you go, definitely tell us more about the THC magazine. You held up some earlier. I've seen pictures on your LinkedIn and stuff. It looks like and also you just talked about how there's so many stories in it. So please just tell us a bit about THC magazine and the message of the publication, and then we'd also love to hear kind of what you have coming up in the future, if there's any events or anything like that people can look for you or your organization at.
Well, yes, I'm actually going to start off with that one because February 15th and 16th, we're hosting the Wisconsin Cannabis Industry and Policy Summit. And that information is also on our website, as well as the Eventbrite link registration, sponsorship information. It's really exciting. Our organization is founded in Cambridge, Wisconsin. The organization is founded by Wisconsin tribal entrepreneurs and leaders. So it made perfect sense to take that national conversation and hone back in on what's happening specifically in Wisconsin, now that the legislature is considering moving forward with some sort of cannabis medical reform in that state. The governor is very much for it, and we want to make sure that the tribes are having a seat at the table and are a part of the robust conversation and consultation process. Aside from that, the big part about doing a lot of this advocacy work is to make sure that tribes are seen and they're heard. And that's kind of how I was seen and heard, was through THC Magazine. Rob Pirro, who is the founder of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, is a member of the Bad River Band of Oneida, and he has been, a visionary, for a long time. He started Candigenous CBD Company in Wisconsin, and while he was, doing that work with Candigenous, running his Paradigm Media Company, doing documentaries, PSAs for tribes. And I don't think that he really has ever thought of turning the camera on himself. And he actually, I came across a press release while I was going to print for THC Magazine. And while I was doing that work, I just decided to pull a couple of a couple of things that I was going to run, and I threw this article in. And my designer, she built the ad based on, their website as well as their press release. We built them this cute little QR code, and then we put it out into the universe. And then about 2 weeks later, I was at a trade show in Las Vegas, and I was sitting next to this young lady who happens to be the communications director for Rob Pirro, and she hands me a doob tube, and I recognize Candigenous's logo on it, and it's, of course, their CBD flower. And I was like, hey, I recognize that company logo. And her and I started this conversation, and she leans over to the other side of her, and it's Rob, and he's like, "What?" And I'm showing him the magazine, and he's just like blown away. He's like,
That's
"You didn't know
cool.
THC magazine existed." He had no idea that this was going on. So unbeknownst to me, he was kind of having me vetted while he was teeing up this organization, and reached out to see if I would lead the organization. And I just really, like I said, I feel honored that they asked me to do it. I'm very much overwhelmed because it's a lot of work, but at the same time, it's my passion for what I do. And so, I'm just trying to find ways for them both to grow and evolve at the same time. THC Magazine's taken a little bit of a downturn, with getting this organization started up, but it's not because
Yeah.
there's a lack of stories or a lack of support. I get inbox emails all the time. Hey, can I buy a page in THC Magazine? And I'm like, I'm not building it right now. But our next issue will actually have Gary Farmer on the cover. And so I'm really excited to get it back into production, as well as we have had a couple of requests, as well as sponsors reach out to say, can we get republications of like, take 2 or 3 stories from every single issue of the past and make like a hardbound version of THC? And I'm like, that's a great idea. And then, taking a step further than that, in the Bay Area Latino Cannabis Association, Director Javier says, you should make it bilingual. We'll help you with that, So,
That's cool.
there's some great things in development just through partnerships and through relationships that have been created. I would love to see THC Magazine done in a bilingual edition. That would be amazing.
That would be amazing.
Well, Mary, where can people learn more about you and keep in touch with the organizations and everything like that? Basically, plug all the links and websites and all that kind of stuff.
All the plugs.
Okay, so for all of my crazy personal antics, most people like to check things out at Mary Jane _ Flower Girl. That's where I like to just kind of let loose and share a little bit more about my personal life. Share, share and smoke and conversation, go live every once in a while on Instagram. For professional outreach, you can find me on LinkedIn, Mary Jane Oatman. Same with the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. We are also on LinkedIn there. I think the best place, for information on the organization itself is indigenouscannabis.org. And I know for a lot of people are still out there in the Facebook. You can find the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, as well as myself, on the good old trusty Facebook. They're not, still banning and hypersensitive about cannabis content.
Right, totally.
I'm still there, so something's going right.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, JR, were there any kind of final words that you wanted to say before we head out tonight?
I just want to thank you again for your time. I know you must be an extremely, extremely busy person. So we were really honored to have you on the show tonight. And thank you so much. We really appreciate you. And we hope to have you on again to kind of give us updates on how things are going.
Well, I appreciate Cannabis having me, and I'll make sure to subscribe with our ICIA YouTube channel that we have going on now.
Cool.
So that's another place to find us. But I feel like the honor is mine, and I appreciate you guys just being inclusive of, the Indigenous voice. And yes, Mary Jane is my real name. I know people are out there wondering.
Well, thank you so much, Mary Jane. It's really been a pleasure. Been really interesting to learn from you and hear your community stories. And so please, if you've watched this and you've enjoyed it, please support Mary Jane, follow her on Instagram, and keep in touch with her and follow the organization. It's really interesting and important work that they're doing out there. If you enjoyed this interview, you can subscribe on YouTube. We'd really appreciate it. Like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Share this link with your friends so you can expand your horizons and learn. And we appreciate everyone's time tonight. We hope you have a good one in the future. Mary Jane, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this evening.
Thank you, Cannabis. Thank you so much, Q and JR. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.
Growers love,
Peace.
everyone. Growers love.